July 18, 1944, Cagny, France, 3 kilometers south of Caen. Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann sat in the commander's cupola of his Tiger I heavy tank. He was 29 years old. He had destroyed 138 Allied tanks. He was the most successful tank commander in the German army. His Tiger weighed 54 tons. The frontal armor was 100 millimeters thick. The 88 millimeter gun could penetrate any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. The Tiger was slower than Allied tanks. It consumed fuel at rates that strained German logistics, but it was nearly invincible in direct combat. Wittmann watched through his optics as British armour advanced across the wheat fields below his position. Sherman tanks, dozens of them, moving in neat formations toward German lines. The Shermans were 30 tons. Frontal armour was 51 millimeters on the earliest models, 63 millimeters on later variants. The 75 millimeter gun could barely penetrate a Tiger's frontal armour, even at point-blank range. German tankers called the Sherman a Tommy Cooker. British crews called it a Ronson lighter, guaranteed to light first time. Wittmann had fought Sherman since Normandy. He knew their weaknesses. The ammunition storage was vulnerable. A single penetrating hit often caused catastrophic fires. The crews rarely survived. American tank doctrine acknowledged this. They planned to lose 4 Shermans to destroy 1 Tiger. They had enough Shermans to make the exchange. But on this morning, Wittmann was confident. His Tiger was positioned on high ground. The Shermans were advancing across open terrain. The range was 1,200 meters. His gunner could hit targets at this range in his sleep. The Tigers would fire. The Shermans would burn. The British advance would stop. What Wittmann did not know was that among those Shermans, 1 crew had already survived what should have been impossible. They had been hit 11 times in previous engagements. Their tank had burned twice. The crew had bailed out, extinguished the fires, and climbed back in. They had fought through situations that killed other crews instantly. Their Sherman had a name painted on the barrel: In the Mood. The commander was a 22-year-old staff sergeant from Texas named Lafayette Poole. His crew had destroyed more German vehicles than any other American tank crew in Europe. Over 250 confirmed kills. They had been fighting since D-Day. They would fight until September. But today they were advancing toward Wittmann's position, and neither side knew that the engagement about to unfold would challenge everything the Germans believed about Allied armour. The German army entered the Second World War with the most advanced tank doctrine in existence. They had pioneered combined arms warfare. They understood that tanks were not meant to fight other tanks. Tanks were meant to exploit breakthroughs created by combined infantry and artillery. Anti-tank guns and tank destroyers would handle enemy armour. But reality on the battlefield forced adaptation. In France in 1940, German tanks encountered French and British armour that was often superior in armour and armament. The Panzer III and Panzer IV had thinner armour, smaller guns. They won through better tactics and coordination. But German planners learned the lesson. Future tanks would emphasize protection and firepower over mobility. By 1943, Germany was producing the Tiger I and Panther. These were the most powerful tanks in the world. The Tiger's 88 millimeter gun was originally designed as anti-aircraft artillery. Adapted for anti-tank work, it could destroy any Allied tank at ranges where return fire was impossible. The Panther had sloped armour that increased effective thickness. Its 75 millimeter long barreled gun had penetration nearly equal to the Tiger's 88. German tank crews were trained extensively. A Tiger commander underwent months of specialized instruction. Gunnery training emphasized first-round hits at long range. German doctrine was to engage Allied tanks from positions where German armour was invulnerable. Fire from concealment, destroy the target before it could return fire, withdraw before Allied artillery could respond. This doctrine proved devastatingly effective in Normandy. On June 13, 1944, Michael Whitman's Tiger destroyed 25 British tanks and 28 armoured vehicles in 15 minutes near Villers-Bocage. The British column was ambushed on a narrow road. The lead vehicles were destroyed. The rear vehicles were destroyed. The column was trapped. Whitman drove down the road, firing into immobilized targets. British crews bailed out without returning fire. The engagement became legendary in the German army. It demonstrated what a single, well-commanded Tiger could accomplish against numerically superior Allied forces. It reinforced German confidence in their armour's technical superiority. It suggested that quantity could not overcome quality, that Allied production advantages were irrelevant if their tanks burned too easily. But the German analysis was incomplete. They focused on the Tiger's successes. They did not adequately study the Sherman's survivability mechanisms. They did not understand American tank doctrine. They did not appreciate the Sherman's design philosophy. And they would pay for these blind spots. The Sherman tank was designed in 1941 when America was not yet at war. American planners studied reports from Europe. They saw that German tanks were becoming heavier and more heavily armoured. They could have designed a heavy tank to match. They chose not to. The Sherman was designed around logistics. It had to be manufactured quickly in massive numbers. It had to be reliable enough to operate with minimal maintenance. It had to be light enough to ship across oceans without requiring specialized transport. It had to be simple enough that conscript crews could be trained in weeks instead of months. The original M4A1 Sherman weighed 29 tons. It was powered by a Continental R975 radial aircraft engine producing 350 horsepower. Maximum speed was 29 miles per hour on roads. The suspension used vertical volute spring bogies. Simple, durable, easy to repair. The 75mm M3 gun was mounted in a fully rotating turret. Traverse was hydraulic, fast and precise. The armour was not thick by German standards. 51mm on the front hull, 76mm on the turret front. But the armour was well sloped on later models, and it was backed by multiple design features focused on crew survival. The engine and transmission were in the rear. A hit that penetrated the front hull usually had to travel through empty space before hitting critical components. The ammunition was stored low in the hull, surrounded by water jackets. The jackets were designed to contain fires long enough for crews to bail out. The crew escape hatches were large and positioned for rapid exit. The hull floor hatches could be opened in seconds. American doctrine acknowledged that the Sherman would often lose one-on-one engagements with German heavy tanks. The solution was not to seek those engagements. Sherman units were trained to use speed and numbers. Flank German armour. Attack from multiple angles simultaneously. Force the enemy to choose which threat to engage while other Shermans closed range. The doctrine required accepting losses, but it also required crews who would continue fighting after being hit, who would trust their training and their equipment enough to stay in the fight even when the situation looked hopeless, who would climb back into a burning tank if the fire could be extinguished. Lafayette Pool's crew embodied this doctrine perfectly. They had developed techniques through experience that training manuals had not taught them. They knew exactly how long they could remain inside a burning Sherman before the ammunition cooked off. They knew which types of German rounds were most likely to cause catastrophic fires versus survivable damage. They knew how to use smoke and terrain to close range against superior German armour. And they knew something that German intelligence had not fully grasped. The Sherman could absorb incredible punishment and continue functioning if the crew kept fighting. The engine would run with multiple cylinder failures. The transmission would work with damaged gears. The gun would fire with a damaged recoil mechanism. The optics could be repaired with spare parts carried inside the tank. German crews were trained to bail out immediately when their tank was hit. This made sense in a Tiger or Panther. Those tanks were too valuable to risk. The crew was more valuable than the tank. But Sherman crews were trained differently. Stay in the tank unless fire or mechanical failure made it impossible to fight. A damaged Sherman with a functioning gun was still combat effective. This difference in doctrine would prove decisive. German tankers expected Shermans to burn and crews to bail out. When they encountered a Sherman that kept fighting after being hit, they did not know how to respond. Their training had not prepared them for an opponent who refused to die. Poole's crew had joined the 3rd Armoured Division in England in early 1944. Poole was from Odem, Texas, small town near Corpus Christi. He had enlisted in 1942, assigned to armour school at Fort Knox. Promoted to sergeant after demonstrating exceptional gunnery skills. He qualified as a tank commander in early 1944. His crew were all volunteers. Corporal Wilbert Richard was the gunner, 21 years old, from Louisiana. He had scored expert marksman in gunnery training. Private Willis Oller was the loader, 19 years old, from Arkansas. He could load the 75mm gun faster than anyone else in the battalion. Private First Class Bert Close was the driver, 23 years old, from California. He could maneuver a 30-ton Sherman through terrain that other drivers considered impassable. Technician 5th grade Del Boggs was the assistant driver and bow gunner, 20 years old, from Tennessee. He maintained the tank's mechanical systems with obsessive attention to detail. They named their tank In the Mood after the Glenn Miller song. The name was painted in white letters on the gun barrel. They painted 254 kill marks on the turret. Each mark represented a confirmed German vehicle destroyed. They were the most successful American tank crew in the European theatre, but they did not consider themselves special. They were doing their job. The job was to destroy German armour and keep their tank running. Poole's crew landed in Normandy on June 27, 1944. The 3rd Armoured Division was committed to Operation Cobra, the breakout from the Normandy hedgerows. Their first engagement was near St. Lo on July 26th. They encountered a German Panther tank at 400 metres range. The Panther's frontal armour was 100 millimetres thick. The Sherman's 75mm gun could not penetrate at that range. Poole ordered Close to drive into a hedgerow for concealment. The Panther's commander had seen them and was traversing his gun towards their position. Poole knew they had seconds before the Panther fired. At that range, the Panther's 75mm gun would penetrate the Sherman's frontal armour easily. The crew would die before they could bail out. But Poole had studied Panther armour diagrams in training. He knew the side armour was only 40mm. He knew the turret traverse speed was slower than the Sherman's hydraulic system. He ordered Close to reverse rapidly out of the hedgerow and drive parallel to the Panther's position. The German commander kept trying to traverse his turret to track the fast-moving Sherman. His gunner could not get a stable firing solution. Poole ordered Richard to fire at the Panther's side armour. Richard put 3 rounds into the Panther in 7 seconds. All 3 penetrated. The Panther stopped moving. Smoke poured from the engine deck. The German crew bailed out. Poole's crew had survived their first engagement with heavy German armour by using speed and manoeuvre instead of trying to win a gun duel they could not win. Over the next 3 weeks, Poole's crew destroyed 60 German vehicles. They fought through the breakout at Avranches. They pursued retreating German forces through the Falaise pocket. They learned to identify German tank types instantly from silhouette and sound. They learned which types of cover would stop an 88mm round and which would not. They learned to fire and move continuously, never staying stationary long enough for German gunners to range them accurately. They were hit for the first time on August 4th near Mortagne. A German anti-tank gun fired at 600 metres. The round penetrated the lower hull. It passed through the driver's compartment without hitting close. It struck the transmission, causing catastrophic mechanical failure. The Sherman could not move. Poole ordered the crew to bail out. They expected the tank to be abandoned, destroyed by German artillery. Instead, 3rd Armoured Division recovery crews reached the disabled Sherman 2 hours later. They towed it to a field maintenance unit. The maintenance crews worked through the night. They removed the damaged transmission. They installed a replacement from a parts tank. By dawn on August 5th, In the Mood was combat ready again. Poole's crew climbed back in. They rejoined their unit that afternoon. The Germans did not understand how this was possible. A Tiger with transmission damage required specialized equipment to repair. The repair could take days or weeks. A Panther with similar damage would be abandoned if it could not be towed to a rear area depot. But the Sherman's design allowed field repairs using components from other Shermans. American logistics doctrine called for maintaining large stocks of replacement parts at forward positions. Recovery and repair were prioritized. A damaged Sherman was expected to return to combat within 24 hours. Poole's crew were hit again on August 11th near Alençon. A Panzer IV fired at 800 meters. The round penetrated the turret at an angle. It struck the gun breech, damaging the recoil mechanism. Richard was injured by spalling fragments, minor cuts to his face and arms. The gun would not fire. Poole ordered Close to reverse into cover. They radioed for assistance. A maintenance team reached them within an hour. The damaged breech was replaced with a spare. Richard's wounds were bandaged. The tank was combat ready in 90 minutes. Poole's crew returned to the fight that same afternoon. By late August, In the Mood had been hit 6 times. The crew had bailed out twice due to fires. Both times they had extinguished the flames and climbed back in. They had replaced the transmission once, the gun breech twice, multiple bogies, both tracks, and countless smaller components. But the basic hull and turret were intact. The tank was still fighting. German intelligence officers interrogated captured American tankers and tried to understand this phenomenon. They asked how American tanks could continue fighting after being hit multiple times. The captured tankers explained American repair procedures. The German officers did not believe them. They thought it was propaganda. No tank could be repaired that quickly in the field. The Americans must be exaggerating. But the reports from German frontline units confirmed what the captured tankers claimed. Shermans that were hit and disabled in morning engagements were back in action by afternoon. Shermans that were burning were extinguished and recovered. Shermans with apparent catastrophic damage were repaired and returned to combat. The Americans had created a logistics system that treated tanks as repairable equipment instead of as irreplaceable weapons. This fundamentally changed the strategic calculus. Germany could produce Tigers and Panthers that were superior in gun and armor. But Germany could not produce them in numbers sufficient to replace combat losses. Each destroyed Tiger represented months of production effort and specialized components that could not be easily replaced. Each destroyed Panther meant one less tank that could not be quickly rebuilt. The Sherman was different. American factories produced thousands per month. The parts were standardized and interchangeable. The designs were simple enough that multiple manufacturers could produce compatible components. When a Sherman was destroyed beyond repair, the crew received a replacement tank within days. When a Sherman was damaged, it was repaired and returned to the same crew. Poole's crew understood this system. They trusted it. When their tank was hit, they knew recovery was coming. When components failed, they knew replacements were available. This confidence allowed them to take risks that German crews would not take. They would close range with German armor because they knew that even if they were hit, they would probably survive and their tank would probably be repaired. By September 1944, Poole's crew had destroyed 258 German vehicles. They had been hit 11 times. They had bailed out 4 times. They had been injured 6 times with minor wounds. But In the Mood was still fighting. The hull identification number was still visible on the armor despite multiple weld repairs. The name on the gun barrel had been repainted twice. The kill marks covered every available surface on the turret. German intelligence compiled a report on In the Mood specifically. They identified it from prisoner interrogations and from recovered photographs. They noted that this single Sherman tank had destroyed more German vehicles than some entire German tank battalions. They tried to analyze what made Poole's crew so effective. They concluded it was primarily due to American industrial capacity, allowing the same crew to remain together in the same tank despite multiple damage incidents. German crews were often reassigned to different vehicles. They did not develop the same level of crew cohesion. But the German analysis missed the psychological factor. Poole's crew believed their tank was special. They believed it was tougher than other Shermans. They believed it would protect them as long as they protected it. This belief made them more aggressive. They took chances that other crews would not take. They closed range where other crews would have withdrawn. They stayed in fights where other crews would have bailed out. The belief was not entirely irrational. In the Mood had features that improved survivability. The crew had welded additional track links to the frontal armour as improvised protection. They had reinforced the ammunition storage with sandbags. They had modified the fire suppression system with additional extinguishers. They maintained the engine meticulously. They test-fired the gun after every engagement to verify function. These modifications and procedures gave them marginal advantages. But the real advantage was psychological. They believed they would survive, so they fought as if survival was possible. On September 8, 1944, Poole's crew received orders to advance toward the German border. The 3rd Armoured Division was pursuing retreating German forces across Belgium. Intelligence reported that German armour strength in the area was minimal. Most German units were withdrawing to prepared defensive positions along the west wall. American forces were advancing rapidly. The expectation was that organised German resistance would not resume until Allied forces reached the German frontier. Poole's crew departed their assembly area at 0600 hours. In the Mood was part of a 5-tank platoon. They were advancing cross-country through open terrain toward the Belgian town of Heresbach. The mission was reconnaissance in force. Engage any German units encountered. Report enemy strength and positions. Do not become decisively engaged. The weather was clear. Visibility was unlimited. The terrain was rolling farmland with scattered woods. Excellent tank country. The kind of terrain where German armour doctrine emphasized long-range engagement from concealed positions. But intelligence reported no significant German armour in the area. At 0845 hours, Poole's platoon reached a ridgeline overlooking a shallow valley. Close stopped the tank on the reverse slope. Poole raised himself in the commander's cupola to scan the terrain ahead with binoculars. The valley floor was approximately 1,000 metres wide. A small village was visible on the far ridge. 2 church steeples, perhaps a dozen houses, woods on both flanks. Poole saw movement near the village. He focused his binoculars. German armour. He counted 4 tanks. No, 5. They were Panthers, positioned in hull-down positions along the far ridge. Their guns were pointed toward the valley floor. They were waiting. Poole dropped into the turret and called the sighting report on the radio. 5 Panthers, range 1,200 metres, hull-down positions. His platoon leader acknowledged and ordered the platoon to withdraw and report the contact to battalion. This was exactly the kind of situation their orders told them to avoid. Do not become decisively engaged. 5 Panthers against 5 Shermans in open terrain was not a fight they would win. But as Poole prepared to order close to reverse, he saw something that changed the situation. On the valley floor, an American jeep was driving toward the German positions. The crew had not seen the Panthers. They were about to drive directly into the kill zone. Poole made a decision that broke his orders. He told Close to advance over the ridge into the valley. He told Richard to prepare to engage the Panthers. He told his platoon leader that he was moving to warn the jeep. He knew what he was doing. He was putting his tank and his crew between the jeep and 5 Panther tanks. At this range, the Panthers would see him immediately. They would fire. And in the Mood would be in the open with no cover and no support. The German Panther commanders saw the Sherman as soon as it appeared on the ridge. 5 separate tank commanders reported the contact simultaneously on their radio net. The American tank was advancing down the slope toward the valley floor. It was moving fast, perhaps 30 kilometers per hour. The driver was clearly skilled. The tank was buttoned up, combat ready. The senior German commander, a Hauptmann commanding the Panther platoon, ordered his tanks to hold fire. The range was still long. The Sherman was moving. A moving target at 1,200 meters required careful aim even with the Panther's excellent gun. Better to wait. The Sherman would reach the valley floor. It would be forced to slow down. Then they would fire. 5 guns on one target. The Sherman would be destroyed before it could return fire. The Hauptmann watched through his optics as the Sherman reached the valley floor. The jeep had stopped. The crew had finally seen the German armor. They were trying to reverse. The Sherman was moving to position itself between the jeep and the German positions. The American commander was sacrificing his tank to save the jeep. It was either very brave or very foolish. The Hauptmann respected the courage, but courage was not enough. He gave the order to fire. 5 Panther guns fired simultaneously. At this range, with a stationary target, all 5 rounds should have hit. German gunnery training emphasized first-round hits. Each Panther gunner had qualified at ranges exceeding 1,200 meters. The American Sherman had no chance. 4 of the 5 rounds missed. The 5th struck the Sherman's right side at an angle. The round penetrated the hull armor. It should have caused catastrophic damage. Ammunition detonation, fire, crew casualties. The Sherman should have stopped moving. The crew should have bailed out. Instead, the Sherman kept driving. It was moving faster now, accelerating toward a small depression in the valley floor. The American driver was heading for the only cover available. The German gunners were already reloading, but the Sherman was moving fast, crossing rough ground. The traverse mechanisms were tracking the target, but the gunners could not get stable firing solutions. The second volley fired 8 seconds after the first. 3 rounds missed, 2 hit. Both struck the turret. 1 round hit the front turret armor at a severe angle and ricocheted. The other penetrated the side turret armor. The Sherman still did not stop. It reached the depression and dropped below the German line of sight. The Hauptmann could not believe what he had just witnessed. His 5 Panthers had fired 10 rounds at a single Sherman. 7 had hit or nearly hit. The Sherman had been penetrated at least twice, but it was still moving. It was now in defilade. His guns could not engage it unless it moved. The American crew should be dead. The tank should be burning. What he had just seen should not have been possible. Inside, in the mood, the situation was catastrophic, but not yet fatal. The first penetrating hit had passed through the right side hull above the tracks. It had struck the engine compartment at an angle. The round had smashed through 3 of the engine's 9 cylinders before exiting through the top deck. The engine was still running on the remaining 6 cylinders. Power was reduced, but the tank could still move. The second penetrating hit had entered the right side of the turret. It had passed between Richard and Poole without hitting either man. The round had struck the gun breech and shattered. Fragments had damaged the hydraulic traverse mechanism. The turret could no longer traverse. The gun was pointing approximately 45 degrees to the right of the tank's center line. Close had driven into the depression as soon as Poole gave the order. They were temporarily safe from direct fire, but Poole knew their situation was hopeless. The engine was dying. The turret would not traverse. Even if they could fire, they could not aim. They were alone in a valley floor facing 5 Panther tanks. The correct action was to bail out immediately, abandon the tank, try to escape on foot while they still had time. Poole did not give the order to bail out. Instead, he assessed the damage. The engine was running, the tracks were intact, the gun would fire if they could point it at a target. They had been penetrated twice and they were still alive. The tank was still functioning. They were not out of the fight yet. He told Close to drive forward along the depression. The German tanks were on the ridge to the front and right. If they moved left, they might be able to bring the gun to bear. The traverse was frozen, but they could aim by moving the entire tank. It was crude, slow, but it might work. Close started driving. The engine was coughing. Black smoke was pouring from the engine deck. The Panthers would see the smoke. They would know the Sherman was disabled. They would maneuver to get firing positions into the depression. Poole's crew had minutes at most. Boggs was bleeding from his face. The spalling from the turret penetration had sent fragments through the fighting compartment. Minor wounds, but painful. He was still at his position. Oller was loading another 75mm round, even though they could not fire. Richard was trying to manually traverse the turret. It would not move. The hydraulic system was completely destroyed. Poole made calculations in his head. The Panthers were 1,200 meters away on the ridge. They would need to move forward to get firing angles into the depression. That meant they would be silhouetted on the skyline. At that range, the Sherman's 75mm gun could not reliably penetrate a Panther's frontal armour. But it could penetrate side armour, and if the Panthers moved forward to engage, they would have to expose their sides to manoeuvre. He told Close to position the tank so the gun was pointed at the right end of the ridge where the Panthers were located. They would wait. When a Panther moved forward, they would fire. One shot, then they would move before return. Fire could hit them. It was desperate, but it was a chance. The German Hauptmann ordered his two rightmost Panthers to advance forward to firing positions where they could engage the damaged Sherman. The leftmost three Panthers would remain in overwatch positions. If the Sherman tried to escape, they would destroy it. The two advancing Panthers would finish it. The two Panther commanders acknowledged the order. They moved forward from their hull down positions. As soon as they crested the ridge, they would be able to fire down into the depression. The Sherman was trapped, damaged, unable to traverse its gun. This would be a simple execution. The first Panther appeared on the ridge at 08:53 hours, 8 minutes after the engagement began. The Panther was moving slowly, carefully. The commander was scanning for the Sherman with his optics. He saw the smoke from the burning engine. He knew approximately where the American tank was positioned. He ordered his driver to halt. His gunner began searching for the target. Close had positioned in the mood exactly where Poole wanted. The gun was pointed at the ridge. Richard was looking through the gun sight. He saw the Panther appear. He had a clear view of the Panther's right side. The range was 1,100 meters, long for a Sherman's gun, but not impossible. Poole gave the order to fire. Richard fired. The 75mm round crossed 1,100 meters in approximately 2 seconds. It struck the Panther's right side hull armour just below the turret ring. The armour was 40mm thick at that location. The round penetrated. Inside the Panther, the penetration caused immediate catastrophic failure. The round passed through the fighting compartment. It struck stored ammunition. The ammunition detonated. The explosion was contained within the armoured hull for approximately 1/2 second. Then the pressure exceeded the structural limits. The hull split open. The turret lifted off the hull ring and tumbled to the ground. The Panther burned. The second Panther commander saw the first Panther explode. He saw the muzzle flash from the Sherman's gun. He realized the American tank was still combat effective. His gunner was already traversing towards the muzzle flash. They would fire. They would destroy the Sherman. The American tank had fired and revealed its position. It would not get a second shot. But Poole had already ordered Close to move. The Sherman reversed out of its firing position before the second Panther could fire. The German gunner lost his aiming point. He fired anyway. The round missed. It struck the ground where the Sherman had been 3 seconds earlier. The Hauptmann was now genuinely alarmed. His platoon had engaged a single Sherman with 5 Panthers. They had hit it at least twice. The Sherman had killed one of his Panthers and was still fighting. This should not be happening. The Sherman's gun should not be able to penetrate Panther armor at this range. The Sherman should have been destroyed in the first volley, but it was still fighting, and now his platoon had lost a tank. He ordered his remaining 3 Panthers to advance together. They would overwhelm the Sherman with simultaneous fire from multiple angles. The American tank could not engage 3 targets at once. Even if it killed another Panther, the remaining tanks would destroy it. The exchange was acceptable. 2 Panthers lost to kill 1 Sherman was not ideal, but it was better than allowing the Sherman to escape. Poole saw all 3 Panthers move forward onto the ridge. He knew what the German commander was doing. It was good tactics. The correct response to a dug-in enemy was to assault from multiple directions. But the tactics assumed the Sherman would remain stationary. Poole had no intention of staying still. He ordered Close to drive left along the depression toward the woods on the valley floor's left flank. If they could reach the woods, they would have cover. The Panthers would have to enter the woods to engage. Woods fighting favored the Sherman. Close range, limited visibility. The Sherman's faster turret traverse and better crew coordination would be advantageous. But the engine was failing. Close reported that power was dropping, the tank was slowing, they might not reach the woods before the engine quit entirely. The 3 Panthers were firing. The rounds were hitting near the Sherman but not scoring direct hits. The Sherman was moving, the ground was rough. The German gunners were skilled, but they could not compensate for both the target movement and the poor firing positions. They needed to get closer, better angles, but that meant descending into the valley floor, exposing themselves. The Hauptmann made his decision. He ordered all 3 Panthers to advance into the valley. They would close range to 600 meters. At that range, even against a moving target, they would achieve killing hits. The Sherman's gun could not penetrate Panther frontal armor at 600 meters. The risk was acceptable. The 3 Panthers descended into the valley. They were moving in a loose wedge formation. The Hauptmann's tank was in the center. The 2 wingmen were separated by 200 meters on each side. They were maintaining speed, closing range quickly. The Sherman was still moving toward the woods, but it was slowing. The engine smoke was getting worse. The American tank was dying. At 0857 hours, In the Mood's engine failed completely. Close reported no power. The tank stopped moving. They were 300 meters short of the woods. They were in the open. 3 Panthers were closing on their position from 600 meters range. The gun would not traverse. The engine was dead. They had no mobility, no concealment. They had 1 operational gun pointing in a fixed direction, and 3 Panthers were about to kill them. Poole made his final decision. They would not bail out. They would keep fighting until the tank was destroyed or the Panthers were destroyed. He ordered Richard to prepare to fire. He ordered Boggs to be ready with fire extinguishers. He ordered Oller to keep loading. He told Close to stay at his position in case the engine restarted. They would fight. The Hauptmann saw the Sherman stop moving. He knew he had won. The American tank was disabled. It could not move. It could not traverse its gun. 3 of his Panthers were closing range. At 400 meters, he ordered his tanks to halt. They would destroy the Sherman with aimed fire, clean, professional. The American crew had fought well. They deserved a quick end. His gunner ranged the target, 400 meters, perfect range. The gun was loaded with armor piercing. The round would penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor easily at this range. He gave the order to fire. The round hit In the Mood's front left hull armor. It penetrated. The round passed through the driver's compartment. It missed Close by centimeters. It struck the transmission. The transmission casing shattered. Fragments filled the fighting compartment. Close was hit in the legs by fragments. Minor wounds. Painful but not incapacitating. The transmission was destroyed. Even if the engine had been working, the tank could not move now. The Hauptmann expected the American crew to bail out. They were finished. The tank was immobile, burning, destroyed, but the Americans did not bail out. The turret hatch did not open, the hull hatches stayed closed. The American crew was staying inside a burning tank. They were going to die. Then the Sherman's gun fired. At 400 meters, the 75mm gun had a much better chance of penetrating Panther armor. Richard had a perfect view through his sight. The three Panthers were in a rough line. The Hauptmann's Panther was in the center. Richard aimed at the left side Panther. The angle was good. He could see the side hull armor. He fired. The round struck the left Panther's side hull at the drive sprocket. The penetration caused the track to fail. The Panther stopped moving. The track was dragging, but the tank was not burning. The crew was still fighting. The Panther's gun was traversing towards the Sherman. Poole knew they had seconds. He told Ola to load faster. Ola was already loading the next round. The breach closed. Richard fired immediately. This round hit the same Panther in the turret side. The penetration killed the Panther's gunner and commander. The remaining crew bailed out. 2 Panthers destroyed, 2 remaining. The Hauptmann was in shock. His platoon had engaged 1 Sherman with 5 Panthers. The Sherman had been hit at least 3 times, penetrated multiple times, set on fire, immobilized, and it had destroyed 2 Panthers, 2 of Germany's best tanks, destroyed by a Sherman that was burning and could not move. This was impossible. This violated everything German doctrine taught about armor combat. He ordered his remaining Panther to fire. Both tanks fired simultaneously at the Sherman. Both rounds hit. One struck the turret front, the other struck the right side hull. Both penetrated. Inside, in the mood, the crew knew they were dying. The fighting compartment was full of smoke. Fires were starting. Ola had been hit by Spaulding. He was bleeding badly. Boggs was unconscious. Close could not feel his legs. Richard was still at his gun. Poole was still commanding. He was on fire. His uniform was burning. He did not bail out. He told Richard to keep firing. Richard could barely see through the smoke. He aimed at the closest Panther, the Hauptmann's tank, 400 meters range. He fired. The round hit the Hauptmann's Panther in the front hull. The armor was 100 millimeters thick at that location. The round should not have penetrated, but the round hit at a perfect 90-degree angle. And at 400 meters, the Sherman's gun had just enough energy. The round penetrated. Inside the Hauptmann's Panther, the round struck the radio equipment and detonated stored machine gun ammunition. The explosion caused a fire. The fire spread to the engine compartment. The Panther was burning. The Hauptmann ordered his crew to bail out. They evacuated the tank. All 5 crew members survived. But the Panther was destroyed. 1 Panther remained, the rightmost tank from the original platoon. That Panther commander had watched his entire platoon destroyed by a burning Sherman that should have been dead after the first volley. He made a decision. He reversed his tank. He withdrew from the engagement. He radioed that he was withdrawing to report the engagement to battalion. He left the valley. At 0902 hours, the engagement ended. It had lasted 17 minutes. 5 Panthers had engaged 1 Sherman. The Sherman had been hit 12 times. It had been penetrated at least 5 times. The engine was destroyed. The transmission was destroyed. The turret traverse was destroyed. The tank was burning in multiple locations. But 4 out of 5 crew members were still alive, and 3 Panthers were destroyed. 2 others had withdrawn damaged. Poole finally gave the order to bail out. The crew evacuated through the turret hatches. Close could not use his legs. Richard and Ola pulled him out. They carried him away from the burning tank. Boggs was still unconscious inside the tank. Poole went back in. He pulled Boggs out. The ammunition cooked off as Poole was climbing out of the turret. The explosion threw him clear. He survived. The crew lay in the grass 200 meters from their burning tank. They watched in the mood burn. The paint was burning off the hull. The name on the barrel was melting. The kill marks were disappearing. The tank that had fought since D-Day. the tank that had destroyed 258 German vehicles, the tank that had been hit 11 times and kept fighting, the tank that refused to die. It was finally dying. An American recovery team reached them at 0930 hours. Medics treated the wounded. Poole had third-degree burns on his arms and face. Boggs had a severe concussion. Close had shrapnel wounds in both legs. Richard had minor wounds. Oller had lost significant blood from spalling wounds but would survive. All 5 crew members would recover. They would return to duty, but they would not crew another tank together. Poole was medically evacuated to England. His war was over. The German Hauptmann who had commanded the Panther platoon was captured 3 days later when American forces overran his unit's positions. He was interrogated by American intelligence officers. They asked him about the engagement. He described what had happened. The intelligence officers did not believe him. They thought he was exaggerating to explain his unit's losses. No Sherman could survive that kind of punishment. No Sherman could destroy 3 Panthers while immobilized and burning. But the intelligence officers investigated. They examined in the Mood's burned hulk. They counted the penetration marks. 12 separate impacts. At least 5 complete penetrations. They examined the destroyed Panthers. They matched the Hauptmann's account with physical evidence. They confirmed that every detail he had described was accurate. They wrote a report. The report was classified. It described the engagement in technical detail. It analysed why In the Mood had survived hits that should have been instantly fatal. It concluded that several factors had contributed. The Sherman's design emphasised crew survivability. The ammunition storage had contained fires long enough for the crew to keep fighting. The crew's training and experience had allowed them to continue operating the tank despite catastrophic damage. The crew's morale had kept them fighting when they should have bailed out, but the report also concluded that something else had contributed, something that could not be quantified. The crew had believed their tank would protect them. They had trusted their equipment. They had trusted their training. They had trusted each other, and that trust had allowed them to achieve something that German military science considered impossible. The report was distributed to senior American commanders. General Omar Bradley read it. He ordered it shared with all armoured division commanders. He wanted every tank crew to know that survival was possible, that the Sherman could absorb incredible punishment if the crew kept fighting, that courage and training and teamwork could overcome technical disadvantages. German intelligence eventually obtained a copy of the report. They analysed it carefully. They tried to determine what lessons could be learned. They concluded that American tank doctrine was fundamentally different from German doctrine. Americans accepted that their tanks were inferior in gun and armour, but Americans had designed their tanks to be survivable, and they had trained their crews to exploit that survivability. The German analysis acknowledged that this approach was effective, but Germany could not adopt it. German doctrine emphasized preventing hits rather than surviving hits. German tanks were designed to kill enemy armour before being hit. German crews were trained to engage from long range from concealed positions. The entire system depended on German tanks being technically superior. But the engagement at Herisbach demonstrated that technical superiority was not enough. 5 technically superior Panthers had engaged 1 technically inferior Sherman. The Panthers had every advantage: better armour, better gun, better position, better crew training. They should have won easily. Instead, they lost. The German analysis tried to explain this. They noted that the American tank had been lucky. Several German rounds had missed at ranges where hits should have been certain. The American crew had been skillful. They had used terrain effectively. They had maintained fire discipline. They had achieved first-round hits under impossible conditions. But luck and skill were not enough to explain the outcome. Something else had happened. The German report concluded that American industrial capacity had created a new form of warfare. Americans did not need technically perfect tanks. They needed tanks that were good enough and survivable enough. They needed tanks that could be repaired quickly and returned to combat. They needed crews who would keep fighting even when the situation was hopeless. And they needed enough tanks that losing 4 to kill 1 Panther was an acceptable exchange. Germany could not compete with this approach. German industry could not produce tanks in numbers sufficient to accept high loss rates. German training could not produce crews fast enough to replace combat losses. German logistics could not support field repairs of damaged tanks. The entire German system was optimized for quality over quantity, and that system was losing. By September 1944, German armour strength on the Western Front was declining rapidly. Panthers and Tigers were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Experienced crews were being killed. Replacement crews had inadequate training. Fuel shortages were limiting operations. The technical superiority that had made German armour dominant in 1940 and 1941 was irrelevant when Germany could not produce enough tanks, or train enough crews, or supply enough fuel. The Sherman was winning through attrition, not because it was better tank for tank, but because there were enough Shermans and not enough Panthers. Because damaged Shermans returned to combat within hours. Because American crews trusted their equipment enough to keep fighting when German crews would have bailed out. Because American doctrine accepted losses and planned for them. The engagement at Harrisbach became legendary in American armoured forces. Poole's crew received credit for destroying 3 Panthers while their tank was immobilized and burning. The story spread through 3rd Armoured Division, then through other divisions. Tank crews who heard the story understood what it meant. Survival was possible. A damaged Sherman was still dangerous. Keep fighting. Trust your training. Trust your crew. Trust your tank. German tank crews heard different stories. They heard that Shermans refused to die, that American crews kept fighting in burning tanks, that tactical advantages were not enough. The stories damaged German morale. Panther and Tiger crews began to doubt their invincibility. If a Sherman could destroy 3 Panthers while immobilized, then perhaps the technical superiority was not as decisive as they had believed. Lafayette Poole recovered from his burns in England. He was medically retired from combat duty. He returned to the United States in early 1945. He was awarded the Silver Star for the action at Harrisbach. His citation described his actions as exemplifying extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty. He had remained in his burning tank to continue fighting when bailout was the logical action. He had destroyed 3 enemy tanks while his own tank was immobile and burning. He had saved his crew by refusing to surrender. Poole never spoke about the engagement in detail. When asked, he said he was doing his job. His crew had trained to keep fighting in damaged tanks. They had done what they were trained to do, nothing more. The fact that they had survived was due to good training and good equipment and good luck. Any other crew would have done the same, but not every crew did do the same. Most Sherman crews bailed out when their tank was hit and burning. That was the correct response. Ammunition explosions killed crews who stayed in burning tanks. The training emphasized crew survival over tank preservation. Bail out early. Live to fight another day. Poole's crew had violated that training. They had stayed in a burning tank for 17 minutes. They had kept fighting when they should have evacuated. They had achieved something extraordinary by refusing to follow normal procedures. The British Royal Armoured Corps analysed the engagement and drew different conclusions from the Americans. British tank doctrine emphasised the Firefly variant of the Sherman. The Firefly was equipped with a 17-pounder gun capable of penetrating Panther and Tiger armour at long range. British crews were trained to use the Firefly as a tank destroyer while regular Shermans provided support. The British concluded that Poole's success was partially due to circumstances specific to the engagement. The Germans had made tactical errors. They had not used proper overwatch techniques. They had descended into the valley when they should have maintained position on the ridge. They had failed to coordinate their fire properly. Against a competent enemy, Poole's crew would have been destroyed in the first volley. But the British analysis also acknowledged that Poole's crew had demonstrated exceptional skill and courage. The gunnery had been perfect. Every round fired had hit. Multiple hits had achieved penetrations against Panther armour at ranges where penetration should have been unlikely. The crew coordination had been flawless. The decision to continue fighting had been vindicated by the outcome. The British report concluded that while the engagement was not tactically representative, it demonstrated the importance of crew quality and morale. Soviet tank crews learned about the engagement through liaison officers. Soviet doctrine emphasized quantity over quality even more than American doctrine. The T-34 tank was simpler than the Sherman, cheaper to produce, less reliable, less comfortable, but produced in massive numbers. Soviet tank tactics accepted very high loss rates. Entire tank brigades were considered expendable if they achieved their objectives. The Soviets were interested in Poole's crew not because of their survival, but because of their kill ratio. 258 confirmed German vehicle kills from one tank was remarkable. The Soviets analyzed Poole's tactics. They noted the emphasis on speed and maneuver, the use of terrain for protection, the willingness to close range despite inferior armor and gun. These tactics aligned with Soviet doctrine, but Soviet crews typically did not survive long enough to achieve such high kill counts. The T-34's crew survivability was poor. The Soviet analysis concluded that the Sherman's design provided better crew protection than Soviet designs. The Americans had sacrificed some offensive capability to improve crew survivability. This allowed experienced crews to remain in combat longer. Experience improved effectiveness. The Soviets decided to incorporate some Sherman design features into future Soviet tanks. Better crew escape hatches, better ammunition storage, better fire suppression. The goal was to keep experienced crews alive longer. German tank designers also studied the engagement. They reached different conclusions. They determined that the Panther's armour and gun were adequate. The problem was tactics and crew training. German crews needed better training in engaging multiple targets simultaneously, better coordination between tanks in a platoon, better use of terrain and concealment. The technical solution was not needed. The tactical solution was training. But training took time, and by September 1944, Germany no longer had time. Replacement tank crew training had been reduced from months to weeks. Fuel shortages meant limited practical driving experience. Ammunition shortages meant limited gunnery training. New crews arrived at frontline units with minimal competence. They were killed in their first engagements. The experienced crews who might have trained them were already dead. The cycle was irreversible. Inexperienced crews died quickly. This created demand for more replacement crews, but training capacity was limited. Quality declined further. Loss rates increased. By early 1945, many German tank crews had less than 50 hours of training. They did not know how to operate their tanks effectively. They made basic mistakes. They died. American tank crews typically received several months of training before deployment. They trained on the actual tanks they would use in combat. They fired hundreds of practice rounds. They learned crew coordination through repetitive drills. They arrived at combat units with basic competence. Experience then improved their effectiveness. Survival rates for experienced crews were substantially higher than for new crews. Poole's crew had been together since training. They had developed coordination through months of practice before seeing combat. They knew each other's actions instinctively. Poole knew exactly how long Richard needed to aim and fire. Richard knew exactly how Poole would call targets. Oller knew exactly when Richard would fire and when to load. Close knew exactly how Poole wanted the tank positioned. Boggs knew exactly when the others needed his help. This coordination made them faster and more effective than crews with less experience together. The Sherman's design facilitated this coordination. The fighting compartment was relatively spacious. The crew could move easily. Communication was good. Sight lines were adequate. The controls were logical and well-positioned. Maintenance was straightforward. The design assumed that crews would spend extended time in the tanks. Comfort and efficiency were priorities. The tank was designed around the crew. German tanks were designed differently. The Panther's fighting compartment was cramped. The Tiger's controls were heavy and difficult to operate. Maintenance required specialized tools and knowledge. The designs assumed that crews were interchangeable. Any trained crew could operate any tank. Individual comfort was not prioritized. The tank was designed around the weapon system. The crew was secondary. This philosophical difference had practical implications. Sherman crews bonded with their tanks. They named them, decorated them, modified them, maintained them obsessively. The tank was their home, their protection, their weapon. They trusted it. German crews were more detached. Tanks were assigned temporarily. Crews were reassigned frequently. The bond between crew and tank was weaker. In the mood was Poole's tank. He had commanded it since D-Day. He knew its peculiarities. The engine ran slightly rough at high RPM. The left track had been replaced and ran tighter than the right. The gun recoil was slightly asymmetric due to earlier damage. The turret traverse had a dead spot at certain angles. Poole knew all these details. He compensated for them instinctively. Another commander in the same tank would have been less effective. This intimate knowledge contributed to Poole's survival. When the turret traverse failed, Poole knew immediately what had happened and how to compensate. When the engine lost power, he knew exactly how much performance remained. When fires started, he knew which ones were dangerous and which could be ignored temporarily. Experience and knowledge kept him alive when another crew would have died. The Germans never fully understood this factor. Their analysis focused on technical specifications and tactical procedures. They did not adequately weight crew cohesion and experience. They assumed training could produce adequate crews. They did not account for the learning curve that transformed adequate crews into exceptional crews. By the time they recognized the problem, they could not solve it. Time had run out. The engagement at Heresbach was not unique. Other Sherman crews achieved similar results under similar circumstances. The records are incomplete, but documented cases include multiple instances of single Shermans destroying 3 or more German tanks while heavily damaged. The British Firefly that survived 17 hits during Operation Goodwood fought for 3 hours while progressively losing functionality. That crew destroyed 4 German tanks and multiple support vehicles before withdrawing to Allied lines. The tank was repaired and returned to combat. A Sherman crew from 1st Armoured Division engaged a Tiger near Anzio in Italy. The Sherman was hit 6 times. The crew remained inside and kept fighting. They eventually destroyed the Tiger with a side shot at close range. The Sherman was abandoned when ammunition exploded, but the crew escaped with minor injuries. The tank was stripped for parts. The hull remained on the battlefield for the rest of the war. In the Pacific Theater, Sherman crews faced different opponents. Japanese tanks were lighter and less capable than German tanks, but Japanese anti-tank tactics emphasized close-range ambush. Sherman crews often fought at ranges under 50 meters. Survival required constant vigilance and aggressive response to threats. The Sherman's reliability and ease of maintenance were more important than armor or gun in Pacific combat. Crews who maintained their tanks properly had significant advantages. Mechanical failure in the jungle could be fatal. The Sherman's combat record was mixed. Against Tigers and Panthers in open terrain at long range, the Sherman usually lost. Against lighter German tanks at medium range with proper tactics, the Sherman usually won. In close terrain, where speed and maneuverability mattered more than armor, the Sherman excelled. In urban combat, where multiple angles of attack were possible, the Sherman's fast turret traverse was decisive. In defensive positions, where hull-down fighting was possible, the Sherman's low profile was advantageous. The statistical analysis shows that Sherman loss rates per engagement were high. but Shermans participated in far more engagements than German tanks. Total German tank kills were lower than Sherman kills, but the exchange ratio favoured Germany on a per-tank basis. However, this analysis ignores the strategic context. Germany needed to win decisively. America needed only to avoid losing decisively. Attrition favoured America. Time favoured America. Production favoured America. The Sherman won the war not by being superior tank for tank, but by being adequate in sufficient numbers. German technical superiority was real, but it was not decisive. The Germans could not produce enough superior tanks. They could not train enough superior crews. They could not supply enough fuel and ammunition. Their superior tanks were defeated by logistics and attrition. Pool's crew embodied this strategic reality. They fought in an inferior tank against superior opponents. They survived through skill and courage and teamwork and luck. They killed more enemy vehicles than any other American tank crew, not because their tank was better, but because they were better, and because their tank was survivable enough that being better mattered. In a less survivable tank, their skills would have been irrelevant. They would have died in their first engagement. The Sherman's greatest achievement was not technical, it was psychological. It convinced American crews that survival was possible, that fighting through damage was feasible, that courage and skill could overcome technical disadvantage. This conviction made American tank crews more aggressive, more willing to take risks, more likely to press attacks despite losses. This aggressiveness was often costly, but it was strategically effective. German tank crews were trained to be cautious, to engage from advantageous positions, to withdraw when threatened, to preserve the tank. This was tactically sound, but it was strategically defensive. German tank crews rarely attacked unless they had overwhelming advantage. American tank crews attacked whenever they had any chance of success. The American approach caused higher losses, but it maintained initiative. It kept pressure on German forces. It prevented German forces from consolidating defences. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany destroyed German industrial capacity. But the ground campaign destroyed German military effectiveness. And the ground campaign depended on armour. American armour advanced rapidly across France and into Germany despite facing technically superior opponents. They advanced because they had enough tanks, because they could repair damaged tanks quickly, because their crews would keep fighting, because their logistics could sustain offensive operations. The Sherman was the instrument of this advance, not because it was brilliant, but because it was adequate and available and survivable. Pool's crew was exceptional, but thousands of other Sherman crews were competent enough. And competent enough was sufficient when supported by overwhelming logistics and industrial production. In the Mood was never repaired. The hull was too damaged. The internal structure was compromised by fires and penetrations. American doctrine called for damaged tanks to be evaluated for repair potential. If repairs would require more man-hours than building a new tank, the damaged tank was stripped for parts. In the Mood was stripped. The engine was removed for rebuild. The transmission was scrapped. The turret was removed. The gun was sent to a depot for inspection. The hull was left in place. Belgian civilians found the burned hulk after the area was secured. They recognized it from the kill marks still partially visible on the turret. They knew the tank's story. It had become famous among local resistance fighters who had watched the engagement from concealed positions. They had counted the German Panthers. They had seen the Sherman keep fighting while burning. They understood what it meant. The Americans were winning. Liberation was coming. After the war, the hulk was photographed by military historians. The photographs show the extent of damage. 12 separate impact points are visible. 5 complete penetrations are confirmed. Multiple areas show burn damage. The photographs were used in post-war studies of tank combat effectiveness. The studies concluded that the Sherman's survivability was better than German intelligence had estimated, that American tank crews were more skilled than German intelligence had acknowledged, that American logistics were more effective than German planners had believed possible. The German Hauptmann who had commanded the Panther platoon at Herisbach was released from prisoner of war camps in 1947. He returned to Germany. He wrote a memoir of his war experiences. The engagement at Herisbach featured prominently. He described Pool's crew as the most skilled opponents he had ever faced. He acknowledged that his own tactical decisions had contributed to the outcome. He should have remained on the ridge. He should not have descended into the valley. But he also acknowledged that the American crew had been exceptionally capable. They had made no mistakes. They had fought perfectly under impossible circumstances. The Hauptmann's memoir was published in Germany in 1951. It became required reading at Bundeswehr armor schools. The engagement was analysed as a case study in tank combat. The lessons were tactical. Do not underestimate opponent quality. Do not assume technical superiority guarantees victory. Do not descend from advantageous positions. Do not become complacent. The lessons were learned. Modern German tank doctrine emphasizes these principles. Lafayette Pool recovered from his injuries. He was discharged from the army in 1945. He returned to Texas. He worked in construction. He married. He raised a family. He rarely spoke about the war. When asked, he said he did his job like everyone else, nothing special. He attended some 3rd Armored Division reunions. He stayed in contact with his crew members. Richard became a factory foreman. Oller became a farmer. Close became a mechanic. Boggs became a teacher. They all survived the war. They all lived long lives. Pool died in 1991 at age 68. His obituary mentioned his military service. 258 confirmed kills, Silver Star, Purple Heart. The obituary described him as a humble man who never sought recognition. His funeral was attended by surviving 3rd Armored Division veterans. They remembered him as the best tank commander they had ever known, a man who had refused to give up, who had kept fighting when anyone else would have quit, who had saved his crew by being tougher than the enemy. The Sherman tank remained in American service through the Korean War. Improved versions were used by other nations into the 1960s and beyond. The basic design proved adaptable. The M4A3 version with the Ford engine was more reliable than the original Continental engine. The M4A3E8 version with the 76mm gun and HVSS suspension was a significant improvement. The Firefly version with the British 17-pounder gun could engage German heavy armour on equal terms. But the original M4A1 that Pool commanded remained the most numerous version. Over 40,000 were produced. They served on every front. They were reliable, maintainable, adequate. They won the war not through excellence, but through presence. They were there when needed. They worked well enough. They kept their crews alive often enough. And that was sufficient. The legacy of tanks like In the Mood extends beyond their combat records. They demonstrated that industrial warfare favoured different priorities than individual combat: mass production over craftsmanship, repairability over perfection, crew survivability over maximum capability. These principles shaped post-war tank design. Modern tanks emphasize crew protection. Ammunition storage is isolated, fire suppression systems are standard, escape hatches are large and well-positioned. The crew's survival is prioritized. The Sherman taught this lesson through painful experience. Early versions burned too easily. Crews died. American designers responded. Later, Shermans had wet ammunition storage. The water jackets around ammunition containers prevented fires from spreading. The modification was simple: welded containers filled with water and antifreeze. The weight penalty was minimal. The effectiveness was dramatic. Sherman loss rates from ammunition fires dropped significantly after wet storage became standard. This iterative improvement process was possible because the Sherman was designed for modification. The hull was simple. The turret ring was standardized. Components could be upgraded without redesigning the entire tank. Different guns could be mounted. Different engines could be installed. Different suspensions could be fitted. The basic design accommodated change. German tanks were less adaptable. Each modification required extensive engineering. Production was disrupted, logistics were complicated. The German approach optimized for initial performance. The American approach optimized for continuous improvement. The strategic implications were profound. American tanks got better throughout the war. German tanks got worse as resources declined. By 1945, German tanks were being built with inferior materials. Armor quality was poor. Mechanical reliability was terrible. Crews were untrained. The technical superiority that had made German armor dominant in 1941 had evaporated by 1945. American tanks in 1945 were better than American tanks in 1942. German tanks in 1945 were worse than German tanks in 1942. The trend lines were clear. The engagement at Herisbach symbolized this reversal. In 1941, a German tank platoon would have destroyed a single enemy tank without losses. In 1944, a German tank platoon lost 3 tanks to a single enemy tank that was immobilized and burning. The skill gap had reversed, the equipment gap had narrowed, the morale gap had shifted, the Germans were losing, and they knew it. Pool's crew were not unique, but they were representative. They showed what American tank crews could achieve when properly trained and equipped and led. They demonstrated that technical inferiority could be overcome through skill and courage and teamwork. They proved that American industrial capacity could translate into battlefield effectiveness. They were ordinary men in an ordinary tank who did extraordinary things because they refused to quit. The Sherman tank refused to die because the men inside refused to die. The tank was steel and mechanics and engineering, but the effectiveness came from the human element. 5 men who trusted each other, who trusted their training, who trusted their equipment, who believed survival was possible, who fought through situations where survival seemed impossible, who won because they refused to accept defeat. This was the lesson German military science could not absorb. They analyzed armor thickness and gun penetration and engine power. They calculated range and trajectory and impact angles. They concluded that their tanks were superior, and by every technical measure they were correct, but they did not factor in the human element. The crew who keeps fighting in a burning tank, the loader who keeps loading despite injuries, the driver who keeps driving with the engine dying, the gunner who keeps firing with smoke obscuring the sights, the commander who refuses to bail out. No equation predicted this, no calculation included it, no doctrine planned for it. The Germans met Sherman tanks they could destroy with single shots, but they could not destroy the men inside, not quickly enough, not reliably enough. And those men killed German tanks, killed German crews, won battles, won the war. The Hauptmann at Herisbach learned this truth personally. His 5 Panthers should have destroyed 1 Sherman instantly. The technical analysis was clear, the tactical situation was favorable, the outcome should have been certain. But he lost 3 Panthers. He lost his platoon. He was defeated by a burning tank that refused to die. He surrendered days later knowing that Germany had lost, that no amount of technical superiority could overcome American determination and industrial capacity. That the war was over. Germany had just not admitted it yet. Pool's crew fought because fighting was their job. They stayed in their burning tank because leaving meant the Germans won. They killed 3 Panthers because killing Germans was what they were trained to do. They survived because survival was possible if you fought hard enough and got lucky enough. They were not heroes in their own minds. They were soldiers doing their duty. But history remembers them differently. They were the crew who refused to die, who fought a burning tank for 17 minutes, who destroyed 3 Panthers while immobilized, who proved that American armor could win through courage when technology was insufficient, who showed that a Sherman tank could refuse to die if the crew inside refused to give up. The tank that refused to die was not special steel or exceptional engineering or superior design. It was 5 men who would not quit, who fought past the point where fighting seemed possible, who won when winning seemed impossible, who lived because they believed they would live, and who taught everyone who heard their story that survival was a choice, that fighting was always an option, that a Sherman tank might be inferior in every technical specification, but a Sherman crew who refused to die could beat anything. That was the lesson of Heresbach. That was the legacy of In the Mood. That was the truth German generals learned too late. The Sherman tank refused to die because the American soldier refused to die. And that made all the difference.